Welcome to part 2 of week 5. In part 1, we talked about kind of the general democratic ideal of public policy, and then some of the questions about participation, and then broad theories of politics or the policy process, pluralism and elitism. So now we're going to talk about two theories of policy change itself. So when we talk about elitism and pluralism, those are two very broad general theories about how politics and policy work, right? And how policy process works, how policy gets made. Theories of policy change have more to do with, okay, once we've created a policy, how do we change that policy, right? And how do policy changes happen over time? And they also have very much to do with kind of this question of how much policy is representative of the general public, or public preferences, right? So the first theory is incrementalism. Incrementalism is most often associated with the scholar, the policy and public administration scholar Charles Lindblom. And it basically is very simple. It just says that policy change happens in very small steps, and that most policy changes kind of happen at the margins. So instead of making big, broad, bold changes to specific policies, we kind of tinker around the edges. We kind of adjust something here or there. Now, over time, those incremental changes may add up to be a big change. But that big change doesn't happen quickly. It doesn't happen all at once. And because policies are changed at the margins over long periods of time, you may find some inconsistencies in how those policies are changed, right? So we may make one adjustment in one kind of time period, and then we make an adjustment in another time period that seems counter to that first adjustment. So you kind of see inconsistent policy changes happening, and that may be another reason that it takes a long time for policy change to occur. But those changes are hard to notice, right? So that we may see a policy change all of a sudden has happened, and we kind of look back and say, well, we've been kind of chipping away at this policy or this policy change over long periods of time. This particular theory of policy change is very loosely associated with what we call in policy analysis the branch method of policy change, or the branch method of policy analysis. So what that means is instead of addressing the root cause of a policy, of a problem, root cause of a social problem or a policy problem, we often look at one of the offshoots of that problem instead. So instead of, say, looking at poverty as one whole problem and trying to address the root cause of poverty, we do things to try to alleviate it, right, through public assistance, or we may address an offshoot of that problem, like education, but we're not attacking the root cause of that particular policy. Instead, we're looking at some particular subset of that problem, or kind of an offshoot or consequence of that problem instead. The other theory of policy change that we're interested in for our purposes, I've mentioned before in class, and that is punctuated equilibrium. Right, punctuated equilibrium, some of you may recognize it as a term from biology or evolutionary science, and in fact, social science borrowed it from there. But the concept is the same, right? Is the idea that policy stasis is the norm. In other words, the status quo is the norm. But paradigm shifts can occur, and when that happens, there can be very broad, sharp changes or shifts in the policy environment or the political environment, and we see big policy changes, right? The scholars that we really, in public policy and political science, that we associate punctuated equilibrium with are Frank Baumgartner and Brian Jones. They've co-authored a lot of work, and they've worked a lot in this area of policy change. They wrote a book on this very issue and this very idea. when we talk about sharp changes or shifts in the environment that lead to policy change, what are we talking about? Well, it could be a political event, right? So it could be a party realignment. It could be the election of a new president, or the control of Congress changes partisan hands. It could be some major event, right? Like 9/11 or the stock market crash. It could be that there's some major technological innovation, right? So certainly the introduction of the internet had a huge impact on society and opened the window for major policy changes in a lot of different areas, right? So note that punctuated equilibrium doesn't mean the change is instantaneous, right? It's not like we wake up and one day the policy was one way and we wake up the next day the policy is different. It still takes a little bit of time, but it happens more quickly. The change or the evolution is faster than it is when we think about incrementalism, right? So that is kind of the punctuation part of that. Punctuated equilibrium is, again, loosely associated with the root method of policy change or policy analysis, right? Looking at the root cause of a policy problem and social problem and attacking that root cause so that we can take advantage of that paradigm shift to really wholly address a policy issue rather than just tinkering around the margins the way we would with the branch method or incrementalism. Okay? Regardless of how we theorize about policy or policy change, it doesn't just happen, right? There's some machinery that produces policies and policy outcomes, right? There's a black box, there's a system, there are people, there are institutions, right? And depending on one's theoretical and ideological predispositions and partisan perspectives, one might have different ideas about how change should happen and how it should be managed, right? So when we talk about this, we talk about kind of the rationality of policy change, right? The machinery of how policy change should happen or should be managed. So on one side, we have bureaucratic rationalism, right? People who are using or coming from a point of bureaucratic rationality believe that government agencies can and should order social affairs, right? Civil servants, not politicians, civil servants, so career civil service employees in federal bureaucracies or state bureaucracies, or local bureaucracies for that matter, are in the best position to identify social problems, diagnose them, develop strategies to address them, and solve them in an equitable and nonpartisan manner. Right? So for people who buy into bureaucratic rationalism, authority is vested in the state. And civil servants are the ideal nonpartisan arbiters, right? They're not there because they have some political patronage. They're not appointed, nor are they elected. They earn their jobs on merit, and they have some technical expertise in the policy area in which they work, right? So bureaucratic rationalism places its faith squarely in institutions, right? In bureaucratic institutions and in policymaking institutions, again, at any level, local, state, federal. So you'll sometimes see this referred to as the institutional conception of social welfare, that policy change should happen through the state, right? Through the bureaucracy in particular. On the other side, we have market rationalism, right? And these are people who think and believe that capitalism should order social affairs, okay? And when we think about capitalism ordering social affairs, for example, right, in a modern market economy, a business or a corporation has reasons to respond to the public, right? They want market share. And they also have the power to shape consumer needs and preferences through advertising and by competing with other entrants into that market or other competitors in the market. So this is kind of the Adam Smith idea, right? That if we just let capitalism work, and we let the free market work, that the right policies will emerge as a product of market competition, and as a product of supply and demand, okay? Of course, the downside of market rationalism is that it won't be responsive, the market won't be responsive to people who cannot fully participate in the market, right? So there's going to be some inequities there, and some inequality that emerges if the market or capitalism itself orders social affairs. Here, obviously, the authority is vested in the market rather than the state or institutions. And that's why sometimes you'll see market rationalism related to the residual concept of social welfare. When we think about residualism, we're literally thinking about the fact that market rationalism kind of says if individuals in need will first rely on the market, and if the market fails, then rely on family and friends. And if the family and friends fail, then rely on community or the voluntary sector. And if that fails, government is the last resort to provide, right? And if people will stick to that, then the positive externalities, in other words, the residual benefit, right? Residual conception. The positive externalities from the market will improve social well-being, okay? Often, of course, bureaucratic rationalism is associated, and the institutional conception of social welfare in particular is associated with the Democratic Party. Market rationalism and the residual conception of social welfare is often related to the Republican Party, although there are exceptions, certainly, right? Not everybody follows this same pattern, okay? One thing about bureaucratic rationality, because hopefully by the time you see this, we will have discussed this in class a little bit, but bureaucratic rationality in the institutional conception of social welfare really holds that public policy reflects a steady progress over time toward improved social well-being for all, right? This perspective is usually associated with progressives, and it particularly is reflected in FDR's Second Bill of Rights. This idea that institutions will expand the social welfare state until the basic needs of the entire population are guaranteed as rights of citizenship. And that's where FDR's Second Bill of Rights was going, right? This idea that there are certain things that we see as human rights that might not be just your basic needs, and might not be rights and liberties in the traditional conception, but that access to certain things is part of a right of citizenship. The debate over whether or not healthcare is a right or a privilege fits perfectly into this kind of conception, right? People who see policy change as an institutional conception with bureaucratic rationality guiding it would say that healthcare is a right, that it's something that all citizens should have as a right of citizenship. Those who adhere to market rationalism and the residual conception of social welfare would say that it's a privilege related to the market. And so I think that's a very clear example of kind of the differences between these two points of view. I'm going to stop there so that I don't go over. I'm trying to keep these in 15-minute increments. And we'll come back for part 3 to start talking about the policy process.